Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you from wherever you're tuning in, and thank you so much for joining us today. We are so excited to be sharing this interview and Q&A panel with you today. For this interview, we are joined by Byron Dallas for an exclusive discussion about dialect work, what he does as a dialect coach, and his organization, Talk Like That.
All right, let's get started. Can you please start by introducing yourself, letting us know the role or position that you have within this industry and with a Talk Like That?
I'm Byron Dallas, and I'm a dialect coach for actors and the founder and sole proprietor of Talk Like That, which is a business that helps professionals sound the way they need to sound.
So, Mark, where and how did you begin your journey in the industry, and how did it lead you to where you are now?
Well, I've always had a passion for acting, and that, combined with a lifelong obsession with accents ever since I was a kid, eventually led me to my vocation as a dialect coach. But it's a long journey. I took design communications at college after leaving school, but I focused mainly on the design side of that. So I became a graphic designer and eventually ended up working for the BBC.
Okay.
I was often called upon in that job to not just design graphics, but sometimes to do different voices and accents for various recorded news items. And it was at that point that I decided that I could do more of this. I'm pretty good at it. And later on, a few years later, after working at the BBC, an opportunity arose which took me from London to Toronto, and I got cast in a Sheila Stevenson play called The Memory of Water, and that was in Toronto. But ironically, that play is set in Yorkshire, in the north of England, and I happened to be the only British cast member that was cast in that play. So this was in 2003, and the production hadn't brought in a dialect coach, and which were, it was unusual in those days to bring, dialect coaches into stage productions. But the cast all had, even though they were Canadian, they had pretty good RP accents, like British RP accents, like a Hugh Grant sort of accent, that kind of thing, which a lot of actors are expected to have. But this play was set in a particular part of northern England. It's set in Whitby. And so I was faced with two options. I could either be the only character with an authentic region-specific English accent in a very English play, and that being in the north of England, or I could coach the entire cast in how to act their parts in East Yorkshire accents. And I'm very grateful to the director, Catherine Turner, who invested a lot of trust in me, and so I chose the latter, and basically the rest is history.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm just a little bit more curious as to how Talk Like That kind of came to fruition. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, that takes me to the next part of my journey, really. I'd been teaching in a language school for about 13 years, 13 or 15, and then the COVID pandemic came along, and international students were no longer able or willing to travel because of the safety issues. That forced the school to shut down for the duration. And without the 9-to-5 commitment, I suddenly found myself with a lot of time on my hands, and that allowed me to focus on my true passion, which was coaching. And I always dreamt of doing more dialect coaching, but it was the 9-to-5, the thing that paid the rent that was taking my attention away from that. So I never really got into that on a full-time basis. But that's how Talk Like That came into existence. I'd been putting it off the inevitable for years, and then I had no more excuses. So I started it off online and devoted all my attentions to that.
So, what interested you about dialect work, and what do you love about this area of the industry? Tell us why you love your job.
What don't I love? Everybody speaks at least one dialect, and each dialect comes with its own associated palette of colors. This is the graphic designer in me coming out now. And that palette of colors is what we call an accent, right? And as an actor, you get to choose the canvas, the medium, the method of application, the composition. And so most actors are always looking to broaden their range and play parts that challenge them and make them grow as a performer. And when you learn how to mix the colors that you have in your paint box in other ways, and then add new ones, you begin to see your horizons broaden. And it's something that British and Australian actors learn from the very beginning. Different people sound different from each other, right? And as an actor, you're bringing your own humanity and emotional experience to a role, but there's no reason why that character should speak those words on the page the same way that you do, unless they're from the same region and time as you. And I love that I get to help actors sound more like the person that they're supposed to sound like.
That's amazing. What's your favorite dialect and why?
I'd say that that's a bit like asking a parent who their favorite child is. It's a tough one. They all have their own beauty, right? And which is incidentally in the ear of the beholder in this case. And I think I'd probably give you a different answer depending on when you asked me. I really love the Geordie accent. That's Newcastle in the far northeast of England, because the dialect is so far removed from standard British English, and the accent is so divergent from British RP. And it's got a lot of dialectal words that it shares with Scots, Lowland Scots dialect, and a lot of words and phrases that it's inherited from its occupation by the Vikings, like way back, 1,000 years ago. I also love that part of England, the countryside, the city of Newcastle itself. It's amazing.
So, which dialect do you find the most difficult, either to learn or to teach? Are they the same one? And why is it or they the most difficult?
How easy or hard an accent is to coach really depends on, it's more on where the actor is already at, like in relation to where they need to be, right?
Oh, okay.
So rather than how close the actor is to becoming that character, because the accent is a part of that character's personality. So it's not something that, it's not something you layer on top, right? It has to be embedded within it. So it depends on the individual actor and their skill set that they have so far. For me, though, it'd be the hardest accent to coach or to learn would be the next accent that I haven't learned yet. Which there's a lot of accents, right? So there's a lot that I don't know, because there's always research involved, right? Either research in stuff that you already kind of know, or in something that's can be quite new to you, and that's the exciting part.
It's funny for me as an actor. One of the hardest things, or at least one of the things that I try to work on the most, is usually dialects, because I'm not necessarily the strongest at that. What would you say, for me or for just actors out there in general? Which dialect would you recommend, or would you say is probably one of the easiest?
Yeah, which ones are easiest? I suppose are the ones that you kind of know off by heart. And also for the actor that you're coaching as well, for the client, it's like, whichever is kind of the one closest to them. So then there's just kind of like finite details that they need to focus on in order to get, make that adjustment. But it really varies from individual to individual.
So from studying dialects in college, I know how I was taught how to begin. As a dialect coach, how do you approach beginning your dialect work? And does that differ from dialect to dialect?
I always begin with research, which can be in different stages, right? So first of all, you have to find out from the actor, what the accent is for. Is it for TV? Is it for audio, like an audio book? Is it for a play on the stage or another platform? So, is it an upcoming audition for a role that they've booked? Or maybe it's an accent that they're likely to use in the future that matches with the likely roles that they'll get based on their look. And all this helps to work out your timeline and to, if it's for a role, like who is the character, what clues are there in the text, and where and when did they grow up, that character, not the actor so much. What education did the character get, where they lived, obviously. So basically the next thing is I track down the sources of people who speak in the accent as their own, and I make notes on the features that they share. Like if I can get several sources, then I'll listen to shared features, right? So the speech sounds, the rhythms and intonations, even the way that they use fillers, because those give you a lot of clues as to the vocal posture as well, right? So if there are available videos of people speaking in that accent as their own accent, then you can get visual clues by watching their mouths as well, right? And seeing, once you can see like how the corners of their lips or whatever move and so on, and parts of their facial muscles, that kind of thing. All of those are clues. And so once you have your notes, you can then move out of the research phase and then start working with where the actor is already, and figure out a plan for getting them to the accent destination within the deadline that they've given you.
Does this process vary when it comes to coaching?
Yeah, it does. It can vary quite a lot. So, for example, some accents are much better documented than others. And for example, there are far more videos and audio recordings of people in highly populated modern urban centers, right? But if you get one that's from somewhere more remote, like either geographically or back in time, then you have to do a lot more detective work to find what you need, right? So it's going to be much easier to find real life examples of a modern day multicultural London English than, say, an early 19th century rural Ontario, all right? So because one will have videos all over the internet, and the other one needs piecing together like a jigsaw puzzle, right? Yeah.
What do you do to keep your voice and throat healthy?
Well, I'm not a voice coach, so I try to follow the tips and tricks of those who are voice coaches. So I'd say the best ones that I've picked up from them are like never shout, or try not to shout, especially the day before you have to work on something, on an audition or whatever, or that you need to train, try not to whisper as well, because it's almost as bad for the voice as shouting is. Stay as physically fit as you can because the body affects the voice. Don't smoke, which is a no-brainer. Don't drink too much alcohol because it has a dehydrating effect on your vocal folds. Get as much sleep as you can. Get enough sleep if you can. The more challenging ones I find are don't drink coffee because it dries out your vocals, and cut out any dairy because that gives you a lot of mucus, right? A lot of phlegm involved. There are lots of pointers. There are loads of them, and those are just really scratching the surface. But there's loads of advice out there.
What are some quick fixes, would you say, if you have a sore throat?
Yeah. Well, one, try not to clear your voice. In my opinion, there aren't any quick fixes. I mean, you can take all kinds of stuff to lessen the discomfort, right? I mean, you can take, ibuprofen to make your throat feel better or whatever, but the only fix really is rest. That's the only thing that's going to fix it. Rest and lots of it. Like text. Don't talk. Don't call. Text.
So next I want to ask you a potentially controversial question. As a Canadian actress, I love dialects, but I always wonder if it is appropriate for me to put on a dialect in an audition since I don't already have one. Unnatural accents and auditions, should you do it? Should you put on a dialect as a character choice? Why or why not? And if so, when and why? What are the parameters for this?
Well, by unnatural you mean an accent that they haven't learned growing up?
Yes.
Right. Well, we're all proficient in our own accents because we learnt them over years of trial and error, mirroring the sounds of friends and family around us, right? And it feels natural to us because it's like our signature sound. And we feel like we have the agency and confidence to use it from day to day as we get older. But we subconsciously learn how to switch that to speak slightly differently, in different ways to different people, and it still feels natural. So the thing is, if your character is from a different background and or place from you, then why would they sound the same as you? The character has their own individual signature sound, and that reflects where they've lived, what education they've had, when they grew up, and all of these will make them sound different from you to a lesser or greater extent, right? Because it's not you. They'll sound, of course, their voice is going to sound very similar, but their accent, the way that they actually talk and everything, there's no reason that it's gonna be a photocopy. It's not gonna be a Xerox of your own. The other thing is, there's a reason why so many British and Australian actors get great American roles, and it's not because there weren't enough American actors to fill those roles. It's because those actors proved themselves to be the best fit for that role, and they weren't limited to their own British or Australian accents because they were raised in an environment in which it's natural to acquire speech patterns from other places. Mm-hmm. And I know actors, I have friends who booked roles because they could pull out an accent that they had in their back pocket that they didn't even know they were going to be using that day, and they booked the roles based on the accent that they used, right? Because they had the chance to give a second take in those accents. And so the question really should be, should you ever reconsider using an accent other than your own in an audition? And the answer is yes, you should reconsider it, because you should never act in an accent that is not your own until you make it one of your own. Yeah. That's the key thing, right? And to do that, it takes dedicated hard work and commitment. And that's what dialect coaches help with. Because they'll be able to hear and pinpoint which layers of the accent are divergent from your target accent. And that's how you do it. Like, you have to make that new accent your own. It has to be yours. Now, the thing is, most actors have most actors have an acting coach, right? But how many of them, by comparison, like in North America, how many of them have a dialect coach on speed dial? I think there's a huge difference in attitude on either side of the Atlantic and Pacific, if we include Australia. And unfortunately, you'll often see casting calls for roles that require no accent or a neutral accent, which, neither of those comply with logic or reality.
What about natural accents? Like, why are actors requested to get rid of them? And why does casting seem to prefer, fake accents over real accents, in your opinion?
I think first we need to drill down on some definitions, because anyone who advises someone to get rid of an accent is showing their lack of understanding. Rather than erasing your way of pronouncing words, you just learn another way or other ways. And I think that by natural, you mean acquired over many years, growing up in the speech community, where you're exposed to at least one dialect and its matching accent.
Yeah.
But you could also say that learning a language is natural too. And the more you use it, the more mistakes you make. The more mistakes you make, the more you learn to speak that language well, right? And you can learn to speak that language to increasing levels of proficiency. And you're not faking it. You're not fake speaking that language. You start off speaking it a little, then you speak it quite well until you speak it fluently. And the same goes with an accent too, right? It's like the more you practice it, the more natural it will feel speaking in it. And the more confident you become speaking and acting in the accent, and the less thinking you'll have to do in order to reach it. Mm-hmm. So if by fake you mean like the gap between the version of the accent that casting expect to hear compared to the way that people from that place actually sound, and that's something entirely different, right? If it's a role that appears for a couple of lines, then they might want a shortcut stage accent that they know most people will associate with a certain part of the world, right? Like, that's artistic license. And if, however, it's a main or secondary character, then there's little excuse for not going with authenticity, as long as it doesn't trump clarity. Because, casting is a minefield, right? It comes down to so many decisions that are handed down by executives, first of all, and they need to make sure that the project is going to be adequately funded.
Yeah.
So if they can get the right person for the role and they're from a different If they're from like the same speech, they got the same accent that they're going to be acting with, then that's awesome. But, it's acting, right, that has to be the primary consideration alongside the economic pull that an actor has. So it's not always possible. It's often not possible to cast someone just because they already have the right accent. And that's where we come in. That's where dialect coaches come in.
What advice can you give to actors who are trying to learn a dialect?
Yeah, good one. Think about what you're likely to get cast as. A lot of casting goes by the look. The first thing they see, of course, is the headshot on your resume, and even before they decide whether to call you in or not, do you look, or could you, do you look a certain way? Do you look like you could be Sub-Saharan African or Caribbean? In that case, learn some West African accents, or maybe Jamaican, right? Are you of East Asian descent? Then there's Japanese, there's Korean, there's Mandarin. And of course, anyone, regardless of ethnicity, can learn any of the American or British accents, Irish, Australian, South African, South American or European ones, right? But to casting, I'd say if the role is Jamaican, cast a Jamaican. If it's a Korean, cast a Korean. But I'm not naive enough to think that this is a simple solution, right? To give your production the best chance, you've got to cast the best talent, and that doesn't always neatly align.
Can you walk us through any changes in physicality when, trying to put on a dialect?
Well, let's get the terminology in check first of all. The dialect is what gets put on the page by the author, the writer, right? It's the grammar and the words, and the accent is how you lift that script off the page and make it three-dimensional. So that's the actor's job. So everything is determined by the character. So how that character is portrayed is dependent on how well the actor knows them, how well they know that character. So any actor with basic training will learn how they sit, how they walk, how they hold their head at a certain angle, when when they're listening or whatever, how they sneeze, how they laugh, how and so on and so forth, right? So these are all embodiments of a reality that you created in line with the director's vision, right? And all these, along with where, when, and how they happen to have lived, will also determine how they lift those words off the page and make them flesh. And this will include like the vocal placement, where inside the head the voice resonates, the protrusion of the lip corners, where most of the tongue action is going on, how much or little the jaw moves, and then on top of this there's the timbre of the voice, and which is an overlapping.
Okay.
The important thing is that it's intricately woven in rather than worn on top like a bad toupee, or carried like a heavy weight so that it gets in the way of the character or the performance.
From a filmmaker's perspective, how important is it to hire a dialect coach when working on a project that involves dialects?
If your vision is one that you care about and you want to get right, then you're going to go to great lengths to make sure that, it's something that you can look back on and be proud of.
Exactly.
And it doesn't matter what the level of production is. Like the cost is always a factor. But when you factor in the amount of, I guess, ridicule that can be sparked by not having your cast sufficiently acclimatized to an accent that is part of the fabric of the story, then, you know, your story will become a secondary consideration. And putting it in jeopardy, not just putting the production in jeopardy, but also that, you know, the reputation of the production and the talent as well. Because, you know, hiring dialect coaches basically pays for itself and then some.
Are there tips or tricks that you can offer us for, you know, for consistency when someone's working with a speech?
Yeah, practice. Practice and then check in with your dialect coach, and after that, practice some more. So, I mean, the reality is that most people's accents in real life are not that consistent. I mean, take mine, for example. Sometimes I'll pronounce an R even when it's not followed by a vowel sound, and sometimes I don't. You know, because I'm originally from England, but now I live in Canada. I've lived in Canada since 2002, and but you know, in TV land, consistency is part of the, like, being comfortable with slipping into character and familiarizing yourself with how they talk. And, you know, you have to freestyle it. I mean, you've got to order pizza in it. You've got to chat to your friends in it. You've got to be able to play around in that accent and not just, like, restrict it to a short time. And, you know, I mean, Lady Gaga spent like 6 months in the accent. A lot of people say she didn't quite get that right, but she devoted all the time and effort to it, you know, and it's something you really need to work hard on. I mean, for example, like, you know, when you passed your driving test, could you drive? No, not really. Yeah, I mean, you knew the basics, but it took you years probably to not have to think mirror, signal, maneuver, ease off the brake while applying the accelerator, you know, and the same goes for an accent. Like, practice it till you don't have to think about it anymore.
How can we avoid mockery between specific regional dialects?
Yeah, well, accentism is alive and kicking. I grew up in a city whose accent has been ridiculed within the United Kingdom ever since the end of the Second World War.
Oh my God.
And what happened was, like, a radio sketch show featured a rather exaggerated version of the accent for a comic character who was very slow and not very bright. But from that point onward, for the next 50 or 60 years, like, any character on radio or TV that was portrayed with a Birmingham accent was inevitably a person of either dubious character or low intellect, usually the latter rather than the former. And I mean, Peaky Blinders, okay, maybe those characters are of a dubious character, but it has gone some way to correct the assumptions of you know, that people from Birmingham are stupid. Even though almost none of the actors who are actually in Peaky Blinders are from Birmingham anyway. But so I guess the short answer I'd give is that to avoid mockery, don't perpetuate it. So this goes for all levels. Because if you witness it, even in yourself, then challenge it. Mm-hmm. And if you're a writer or a casting director, then, you know, question the reasons for having that character talk with an accent. Like, if it perpetuates a stereotype, you know, it's lazy. Art imitates life, right? But just a version of it, and it often takes quite a long time for it to catch up with reality.
In your opinion, are there some dialects that are unacceptable for certain people to embody? Has this shifted at all in the recent years?
Yes and yes. Like everything, it's relatively simple on the surface, but it becomes more complicated the closer you look into it, and things are always shifting. So you don't have to look that far back to see comedians or even actors wearing blackface. I mean, in the most recent cases, the intention might have been benign, but now that the industry is finally catching up to consider its effect, right? Like a simple rule of thumb would be to say that if you don't look like anyone who speaks in that accent, don't do it. But it's not quite as simple as that, because, like, what if you can't see the actor? Well, of course, after many years, Hank Azaria changed his mind about voicing Apu in The Simpsons for reasons I shouldn't have to go into. But then consider the audiobook industry. This is one in which men frequently voice women and other genders, and more often vice versa. So, like, for example, it's just one person that tells that story for the book. And let's say you're narrating a book in which a character from a different ethnic origin from you shows up a couple of times in it, and an author is not going to pay a second actor to come in just to voice that character. So, like, right now, that's like the gray area. I mean, one of my clients who's an audiobook narrator, she told me a story about a white voice actor who was offered by a black author to voice her book, which is written in the first person perspective of a black character, fully knowing that the actor is white. I mean, in that case, the actor understandably, respectfully turned the offer down, much to the author's disappointment. But you can see how it's like a really complex matter. It's not cut and dry, and it's always shifting around.
We want to kind of switch it over now to a bit of, we had a few audience questions. We did a poll online, and these were some of the questions that came up that we thought were interesting. I hope you don't mind. Our first question is, what is the quickest way to pick up an accent?
The quickest way? Hire a dialect coach. I mean, it's not the cheapest, but it's definitely the quickest and most effective. Dialect coaches sometimes get called in to help an actor learn their lines in an accent within an hour or two, because there's been a last minute film production decision. And I mean, of course, that's an extreme situation, and it's not ideal, but it does happen.
What is a good habit to get into to expand and improve our dialect repertoire?
Well, first of all, stop watching YouTube how-to videos. Start taking your responsibility to learn accents more seriously. Join a social media group like Talk Like That on Facebook, where you can ask accent-related questions and get answers from professionals. Make a plan to learn some accents and hire a reputable dialect coach.
What are some major accents within the film and television industry that you'd say, performers or actors should have in their back pocket?
Well, that really depends on where you are and what part of the industry you work in. Because, I mean, trends change, demands change. Talk to your agent, if you have one, to find out what gets asked for most for roles. Most actors are expected to have really good command of so-called general American accent and British RP, right? But I mean, why would you stop at that? I mean, it's boring and limited. So, keep your eyes and ears open. Like, just look to expand your horizons, accent-wise.
What type of training do you need to become a dialect coach?
Dialect coaching is one of those rare careers which people arrive at from many different directions and backgrounds. And I mean, some that I know studied voice, others studied acting or were actors. Others were they studied applied linguistics at university, or they've done teaching, or a combination of several of the above. But like all things, the most important thing is experience, gaining experience, and having an undying enthusiasm to never stop learning.
That's so lovely.
I try to get in as much training as my budget and schedule allow. And, I've recently been taking a speech intensive with Knight Thompson Speechworks, which feels great to be a student again.
Very cool.
But, you also learn on the job.
What is some advice you can give actors in the real world who are dealing with the fact that they cannot speak with a standard American accent?
Well, if by standard American accent you mean the so-called general American accent, which is not really a monolithic variety. But if you feel you need a particular accent, the best way to deal with not being able to speak it is to learn it. You either do that or you accept your limitations.
How and where can our fans and fellow filmmakers find and connect with you?
Right, yeah. So there's my Facebook group for actors, which is called Talk Like That. And there's my website, talklikeThat.com. And I'm also on Instagram as talk_like_that. So there's lots of different ways to reach me. My email is mark@talklikeThat.com.
Well, once again, thank you so much, Mark, for your generous time and for sitting down to share your wisdom with us and our festival attendees.
Thanks a lot. It was great fun. Thanks for having me on.
And a huge thank you to you, our viewers, as well.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Have a great day. We'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.